All right. Thank you for being here today. Larada Horner-Miller, writer, poet, educator. I think I can say that based on what I've read. And
Yes.
what have you found to be the similarities between writing a cookbook and writing poetry?
Well, the cookbook was a family project after my mother died. And so I gathered, it's a unique cookbook because I scanned in her recipe cards. And so it's in her handwriting. So I think it's the creative juices that flow through me. I used that idea and people have loved it. When I when I gave it to my family, I made 3 volumes. So I did it 3 different Christmases. And when I got done, my family said, "Oh, you need to sell those." And so I've done that. And people just love the scanned in idea of scanning in the cards with my mother's handwriting, and they're soiled and she's graded them and stuff. So I guess the similarity is that it came out of that creative side of myself.
Nice. Where do you think creativity comes from?
Um, that's a great question. Creativity for me comes from probably the depth of my soul. You know, I see the world differently than someone who doesn't write poetry or write stories, because everything that I see, I grew up in a little ranching community in southeastern Colorado, and my dad was a cowboy. I grew up with a real live cowboy and rode horses and had that experience. And he was poetic. You know, he said to me one time after I'd moved several times, a tumbleweed has to land somewhere. And, I think so. And then, I say it's genetic. I had great grandparents that were poets and they have their poetry on their tombstones. So I think it comes from a variety of places, but I know we see the world differently.
As far as poets see the world differently? Or
Poets,
people? Okay.
yeah, yeah, poets and writers, because something that can be an absolutely glorious moment for me, it can be a fleeting moment to somebody in a way they go. So it's a different world for sure.
Yeah, recognizing those details. I always say that the difference between a writer and not a writer is you write. So if you're
Mhm.
looking at barriers to being a writer, that first thing is noticing the idea, which I think maybe not everybody notices, but once you notice the idea or the detail or the thought occurs, if you write it down, then now you're well on the way to become a writer, because that's the biggest first step, I think. And then you have to arrange it otherwise after that, whether it's a whole poem or a whole idea that comes out at once, or if it's just a line or a piece of it. How do you organize those thoughts when they occur?
Well, I'm going to tell you on my side, it just froze for a minute. So I don't know if it did on yours, but it did. Um, I'm going to throw in a story that's not a poem. I wrote a historic fiction about a story that I had heard my whole life, but I fictionalized it. And the reason I did was it was at a homestead that my parents and I often visited when we were out roaming around the ranch. And I saw blue marble on between the foundation of the house and the first step. And I said to my dad, "Well, I wonder whose that belongs to." And he said, "Oh, people come out and they hunt for fossils and stuff and and people steal stuff off of the homesteads. That's probably somebody was out here." But that I took that blue marble, put it in my pocket, and it rolled and rolled around in my brain. And I went home and within probably 2 or 3 days wrote the story, which became my second book, "When Will Papa Get Home?" And I envisioned this little Mexican girl sitting there on that step with that marble, waiting for her dad to come home. So, there it goes. That's creativity comes from a variety of places, and as you noted, I couldn't not write that book. I mean, it took over my life.
When you said before that creativity came from your soul, where do you think, or what do you think the soul is?
You have great questions. um, well, I think it's all of the um, all of the life experiences that I've had mashed together with the Spirit of God within me that decided I was not going to be defeated, that I was going to take life's lessons and I was going to win. And I think that's it.
Do you have times where when you're putting together a poem or thinking about it, whether it's from notes that you've written or an idea just comes out in full, do you are you able to feel the difference between a poem that you are writing that is through your manifestations and ideas and experiences in our immediate existence versus maybe that coming from somewhere else, like you're a conduit or something like that for some other source?
Oh yes, most definitely. I'm just working on a 4-book series of poetry that wrote starting in 1986, and the first poem in that book is Coba, I Was There, and Coba is a Mayan Indian rune in Mexico. And I wrote that, and that's really the first formal poem that I wrote. But as I was writing it, it took on a life of its own because as I was remembering being in the jungle and being inspired by this ruin where there was a gigantic iguana when we came around the corner and the bees were buzzing in the trees, the canopy above us, I could feel as I was as you know, as the poem came through me, the Mayans around me coming out of the forest, and that was like a surreal. And then I realized I was an English major and had a minor in Spanish, and we studied magical realism. And I realized at that point that that's probably where magical realism came from, because I as I was writing that poem, I was experiencing that, and I'll be anxious to see. My editor just returned my manuscript. I'm working on the rewrite right now, and she just said that the Kobov poem was her favorite out of the whole book. So
Nice. How do you measure whether it's through as an educator and maybe having taught poetry or as a poet yourself or as a reader, maybe all that mixed together? How would you measure the success of a poet? Like, what would you say makes a poet successful?
well, I love your questions. Most poets historically are not popular until they die. I
Mm.
mean, all of the greats, they are revered afterwards. So in our modern world of instant gratification, it's very easy to slip into the mindset that it's not my poetry isn't successful because it hasn't gotten all these raves. But and the sad part about it is the genre of poetry is one of the least supported in the United States, by readers. So I think the success, and I've chosen this from the very beginning of my writing career. I've been self-publishing my books for 10 years now, and I decided very early on that I was doing it for me. I was not doing it for anybody else. I have a voice, and I want my truths, my stories to get out. So when I look at the success of a poem, for me, is that it resonates with me and that hopefully it will resonate with the reader. And if they come from a similar spot, then or something in the poem ignites a question, a hurt, a loss, You know, one of my poems, I end this poetry, this next book that's coming out. My ex and I were in a laundry. We were in a laundromat in Spokane, Washington, and there were little kids playing with the carts, you know, the laundry carts. And it was just hilarious. I mean, here were two little boys. They were a captive audience because they had to be there. It was a Sunday afternoon. Mom had to do the laundry. They could have sat in the corner and been bored and complaining and upset. And what was rich about it is that the people that were in the laundromat were not offended. You know, they let kids be kids. And so I end this book with a poem about those kids. I mean, it was just priceless to see two little kids figuring out that laundry baskets could be race cars.
Yeah, it's something to let a kid be a kid.
Yeah, really.
Probably doesn't happen as much as it should. But yeah, that's good. Why do you think that most poets aren't famous until after they're dead? And a lot of writers too.
Oh, yeah. Well, you know, the thing with poetry is that first of all, I was an English teacher. I taught 20 years. I was an educator for 20 years, but I taught mid school for 20 years. And I I did not have a good experience in my English classes in high school, in middle school. You know, I did not. But when I got to college, to the university level, I was absolutely surrounded by some of the best teachers in the world. And that changed everything. So I think part of the issue is that a lot of people have bad experiences with poetry. They think they have to come up and figure out what the teacher's translation or understanding of the poem is, instead of saying to the student, what did you get out of it? So my poetry units were very different. I shared lots of poetry with them, but I had my students do lots of writing of poetry. They were the poet in the room. And so that I think really, hopefully that helped them. But I don't know, my husband doesn't like poetry and he reads my books and likes my books. So, you know, I think it's a prejudice that the world has, that if they see something in stanzas, they immediately hyperventilate and go, "Oh God, I can't understand this." You know, there's no way. And so instead of just saying, you know what, I'm going to bring what I have to this poem, and maybe I'll understand it and maybe I won't, but maybe something, you know, some of the best poems I've ever read, I didn't understand. It just drenched me and soothed my spirit. Or, you know, one of my favorite poets today is Mary Oliver. And I mean, that woman can write about bugs and make you feel like she is talking about world, you know, she's going to solve the world problems. So I don't know, it's one of those strange things that the sad thing today too is that we don't have readers. You know, we're losing readers left and right, you know, and that's probably one of the saddest things there is.
Yeah, I do find poetry more contemplative. So it's you have to be in that time and place to read it. That might be when you're in TJ Maxx and you see something written on a piece of wood and you're like, "Oh, that's poetic." But to be serious about it, I think it calls for a little bit of reverence where you're trying to connect with whatever that creative force is, or set the table for it at least. And I feel like poetry deserves maybe not more respect than regular writing, but a different type, just to be able to engage with it. Like with poetry readings and the aggrandizement of things, if it's good, okay. But for me, I think a quiet place with some time to think is where you read poetry. And then you read it, you might read the same poem a couple times and then think about it. But just to read it to get through it and then go to the next one and read it to get through it and read it to get through it and read a poetry book like that doesn't seem like the way it should be engaged to me. It's not like
Yeah,
a regular book.
that's interesting. I'm a part of an international meditation group, that was formed during the pandemic, and I lead it. It's a rotation basis, and anytime I read a poem, I always read it to them twice. And what's funny about that is that since I've started that habit, several of the other leaders, when they read a poem, they'll say, okay, we're going to do what Larada does. Let's read it again. And that's, I'm glad you brought that up, because a lot of times, poetry is rich in imagery. And so we have to be willing to take the time to embrace each piece of the imagery, each part of the imagery, and then how that imagery affects you and where it connects with you. And then that may take you down another road that all of a sudden the poem isn't the poem anymore. It's about you. And that's the kind of reading that I love.
Yeah, it's the difference between splashed with water, dunked in water, and just in water. I think
Right.
it's that you have to be immersed in it or whatever to give it time for you to understand it. And I think there are certainly different types of poetry. What would you call your type?
Well, I write free verse. I've played with. I took classes many years ago on different forms of verses, and I write free verse mostly. What's interesting is that a few months ago, my husband and I were in our hot tub, and he said, and I was working on this poetry series. Didn't realize that, I was so focused on that, I didn't realize I was talking about it so much. And he said to me, tell me one word that would describe you as a writer. And so I was trying to come up with the great answer with, genre or, this or that. And I said, well, I don't know. I would say author, I think is what he said. I don't remember. He said, no, you're a poet. And it was just like, oh my, well, this was longer than a couple of years. It wasn't while I was working on the poetry book, because of that, I ran to our storage shed and I dug through, and I knew exactly what boxes it was in. And I grabbed all my journals from when I used to write with my students, and then some other journals that I had that I had written over the years. And that's where the poetry series I'm working on came from, of him saying that to me. It was like, oh my God, yes, I've written 7 books. 4 of them have poetry in them. So free verse is my go-to. I also write haiku. I've really gotten into haiku. Natalie Goldberg is one of my mentors, and she wrote a beautiful book a couple years ago about haiku. And so I started playing with it, and oh my, what you can do with haiku.
Mm. Your husband saying that you're a poet. What a great thing. That would be filed away in my mind of the nicest thing that my spouse has said to me.
Yeah,
Would be
really.
that. That's
Well, it's in my
pretty
intro
great.
in my new book, so let me tell you, I'm honoring for sure.
Yeah, that's nice. I think that would also, how that hits you tells you if you're a poet or not. Like if somebody describes you as a poet and you feel that, then yes, you're a poet. High praise. Good stuff. So free verse. I do appreciate free verse. I think that's what that's what I like to write the most. It's probably what I like to read the most. I don't mind a rhyming poem, or certainly a certain type of rhyme scheme. Even in free verse, it can be there. The tone and pitch I find more engaging than anything else. And the rhymes kind of, for me, make it more predictable. And I feel like you're steering it instead of letting it go with the language of thought versus the language of words. So I'm not sure how that would translate, like a free verse poem versus a rhyming poem, if you translate it into another language. I've done one in Spanish before, aguantando, or holding on, and I enjoy reading it in Spanish and in English, but it has some rhyming elements or some tone elements, but I don't know. What are your thoughts on rhyme scheme versus the free verse then?
I'm a reader and lover of both. You know, when I was in college, my upper level classes, I took Shakespeare and Milton. So obviously, and I did more than just Shakespeare plays. I did all of his poetry, and my husband a couple of years ago bought me an anthology, a poem a day, and I've been reading it every night since. And the majority of them are rhyming poems, and I think there's something to say for rhyming in the fact that I know when I was taking the class where we did all kinds of poetry, you know, we I can't remember the different types now, but we did do rhyming and we did the formatting, um, the ABC, or
Hmm.
the whole thing. And I struggled with it, but I also was challenged. And what I was challenged in, and that's kind of what a haiku does for me, is that it forces you, anytime you get into one of those kind of formatic poems, it forces you to choose words wisely. And it's a whole different experience. When I'm doing free verse, it's like it's just like the thought is just coming out, it's gushing, and it's an evolution, but it's very organic, and when I was trying to do the rhyming and match the formula, it was not organic for me, and it might be for somebody else, but for me it was very formulaic. So I had to da 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 da, and that then I had to, so it's not my style, but I love it because there's something in that is very soothing. When you read one of those sonnets or one of those poems of Yeats or any of those brilliant people, you get the rhythm. And I'm a dancer, so I love rhythm, and so I get the rhythm of the poem. In mine, you don't get the rhythm of the poem.
Well said. What a great explanation. Yes. It's I do I agree. I agree. The there's for me, when I think about success as as a poet, like, what do I think the greats are when I read them? What do I like about them? And when I read Leaves of Grass, I don't like every poem in there. I mean, I don't mind them, but it's not like something that I'm going to say, wow, that really hits home. I want to frame that. But there are some in there, a few that I really like. So I
Yeah.
think that's the success for a poet, is even if you have a book of poetry and somebody reads it all in a way that they think about it and ingest it, not just trying to get through it, and they like one poem, I think that's a success. I'm
Yeah.
not sure why it seems like people become more noted as poets and writers after they're dead, but I wonder if that's just some sort of strange connection with the soul of things, where if it's our soul that feels that, and maybe we're longing for that time in the past, however we deal with it. And maybe that's why we look back on things and go, oh, that's something special, versus a more contemporary one that you could read now, but maybe in 100 years would be celebrated.
Yeah, I think aging, yeah, I agree. I think there's a power to aging and being able to look back. And a lot of times we know more about a poet or writer after they've passed and understand where they're coming from more, so
That's a good point. And then, like, Emily Dickinson, where she has all those poems that were supposed to be destroyed on her death, and then they're published. And I don't like all of them, but I do like a lot of those. And
oh, I do
that's the
too.
free verse of it, and the strangeness of it, where you have to think about it, is, as you said before, I don't understand them all, but I don't think I need to. And maybe I read it one time and understand it a certain way and then read it another and get something different from it. And it's just, at what point are you in your life when you're interacting with that or thinking about it? And I think that's when you can tell the difference between maybe some drivel poetry and actual connection with something, is that it's not this self-aggrandizing celebrate me poetry. It's a, let's look at this thing a little more closely, a little differently than we normally would. I don't know. I hesitate to call any poetry bad, but I've certainly read some bad poetry before.
I don't know if you asked me a question because it froze up on my side. Sorry.
Yeah, that's all right.
We're having a issue with we have Starlink because we live up in the mountains and we're having some issues with it. So,
Is that easy to connect to?
yes, kind of. Yeah. Yeah. So
We have the hurricane type thing going on right now. I'm in Jacksonville, Florida. And it's
whoa.
not, as far as hurricanes go, right here where we are, it's not, doesn't seem like a significant event.
Oh,
But
goodness.
that might be causing some connection issues as well. But
Yeah.
nevertheless, I was just pontificating on poetry and what's the difference between good and bad poetry. But as I said, I hesitate to call anything bad, but I've certainly read bad poetry before.
Yeah, really. As an English teacher, I used to have a blast with these kids on them writing poems, and they would come up with some of the most amazing things because we had spent a lot of time. I was very structured in how I did the unit, and so they would come up with these really amazing things. And I can honestly say I never got a bad poem because they really. Children's spirits are so amazing, and they really got it that it was about the specific. You know, we talked a lot about it's the specific. We're talking about the sight, the smells, all the senses. We did this whole thing around senses, and when I can't remember who the author was, but we read one poem about how do you eat a poem, and they loved that because it was so ridiculous, and so. Yeah, as an adult, I've read bad poetry for sure, but it's just because it doesn't resonate with me is the reason I would consider it bad.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think bad poetry can still be good, but
Yeah.
yeah, it's the audience. But I think there are some elements of poetry, but that you can see in anything when somebody's not being real or sincere about something, then that I think is what makes it tinged a little more from what it should be. Like when somebody's forcing a message and changing the feel of something. I don't know. Maybe that's a little difficult to explain. What drew you to teaching English?
That's really a great question. I was a beautician for 14 years, got divorced, and decided to go back to school. And so I was going to be an occupational therapist. And because for some reason that resonated with me. And because I was a beautician, they accepted a lot of my science classes. So I was going to be in the school, actually further along within about 6 months. And when they told me I was going to get my own cadaver, I realized I was in the wrong spot. Absolutely wrong spot. So I ran over I thought, okay, I can be a teacher. I'll do that. Because my advisor was busy. He just waved me away when I went in to try to talk to him. And when I went to the education department, they welcomed me in, sat me down and said, okay, yeah, well, we would love to have you in the education department. What would you like to teach? And I was like, oh my gosh. I said, well, what do you have? And they said, English, math, science, or social studies. I said, I love to read. Let's do English. And that's how I ended up an English major. I was 2 weeks late. I'd already gone. This was at Colorado State University in Fort Collins. I was 2 weeks into the program. I walked into my first class, and they were partially through Beowulf, which I had never heard before.
Hmm.
And I panicked because it was like, oh my God. But I bit the bullet and I did fine. I did great.
Yeah, yeah, you can catch up with Beowulf.
Yeah, that was wild. I'll never forget that.
When teaching middle school, what grades was that mainly? Is that fifth, sixth, and seventh, or?
No, it was sixth, seventh, and eighth. I spent I taught them all. I taught sixth and eighth mostly. So um, I was in Albuquerque when I taught sixth graders, but before that I taught in Denver, and then I taught in Raton, New Mexico, and it was eighth graders. And so the curriculum was different for each of those, but I always did a poetry unit, and I embraced a mindset at the time. It was Nancy Outwell, and it was based on her book, Writing in the Middle, or Living in the Middle of something. I can remember. Anyway, she did reading and writing workshop. So they did lots of reading, and I didn't read. They read and kept a reading journal. And then writing workshop was totally built around the writing process of, first draft, rewrite, or, brainstorming, first draft, rewrite, final copy. So it was exactly the whole life that I've been living in the last 10 years of my writing world. And so it was a really good experience. The one thing I'd like to tell you that happened that I would encourage nobody else to do is that I wrote my first book and then put it away. My first 2 books, put them away. Finished my teaching career. I was busy dancing all over the country with my ex and teaching, and didn't get back to my writing until after my mother died and I retired. I would not suggest that to anybody because those books haunted me that whole time. And I was still writing. I mean, I was writing through that whole time. But if you have a book that's in you, do not put it away. It only drives you crazy.
You ended up publishing them, though, yes?
Right. Yeah, I did.
Okay.
I published my first one in 2014. And then I've done 7 books and the 3 cookbooks in the last 10 years. And I'm working on another. I have several queued up. I did NaNoWriMo in 2016, and I wrote my 50,000 words, which, if you've never heard of that, that's a phenomenal experience. And I did that. So I've got that book, and then I've got the poetry series. I've got the 4-book poetry series, and then I have another poetry series, and then I have a haiku series. So I have lots left to do.
When you were writing that whole time from when you wrote the first 2 books and then put them away to the point of 2014 when you're starting to publish them, did the way you wrote, like, is not as far as the style, but where you wrote and when you wrote, did that change? Like, did you find you wrote more in the morning or in the evening, or just
I usually did this, I pretty much stayed the same because part of those books, part of what I'm going to be sharing in a series is what I wrote with my students. I was taught to write. The first 7 minutes of class was an organizational time, and I would have a writing prompt on the board that they could write to and I could write to. And so I would do the administrative things of attendance and announcements and everything. And then I always had my journal with me, and I'd slide into a chair next to one of the students, and I would write. So that was daily. I mean, that was several times a day. But then my personal writing time was really at a variety of times. A lot of it was because teaching was so exhaustive. A lot of it was the summer. I spent a lot of times because we were traveling around the United States, and I kept a journal in my lap, and I wrote lots.
That's a good idea to start a class with 7 minutes of writing prompt. Man, that really gets kids in there and then calm down and then they're doing something. What a great idea. Are there any other useful lessons you learned from teaching?
I think one of the biggest, yes, there are. I'm in a writing group. I'm in two writing groups. One meets this afternoon, in fact. We meet weekly and we do Nancy Goldberg's writing practice. So I'm in two writing groups. The other is a critique writing group. They claim to be grandparents to all of my books, and they really are. So I learned that from being a writing teacher, because what I would do with my students is they did have writing groups, and then I was in professional development where we did writing and had critique groups. But I met the majority of my class period when I wasn't teaching writing was meeting individually with the students and critiquing their work. So I learned from that the power of critique and the power of positive critique, not, this stuff is terrible, go throw it in the trash and start again, but always finding that one good thing that they had done, and then saying, let's work on this part. This isn't clear. Need more specifics. So that is absolutely translated into my writing life. And also the whole idea, the writing process that I was taught. So many people, I think, avoid writing because they think they have to come up with the first draft. They have to come up with the final draft the first time they sit down at the table or at the computer. And so I learned, I'm in a book coaching group now too, and we meet weekly. And my book coach says 2 crappy pages a day. That's all you need to write is 2 crappy pages a day. That's freedom. That gives me the permission to not be, totally perfect. The editor is not even engaged in that first draft. So I learned all of that when I was, being educated to be a writing teacher. But I was fortunate. I had phenomenal writing teachers at Colorado State University.
Yeah, I like the 2 crappy pages a day. That's good. Some other things I used for motivation are either a word count, and I don't do that as much anymore, but for the first book, when I was showing up like a job to write that, I was trying to do 3,000 words a day, which worked out all right. But now I think if you say to somebody, yeah, you can be a writer, just write 3,000 words a day. I think it's more of getting something that you're going to do that is going to add up at least by the end of the week. So I would say if anybody was thinking about writing, you got enough time to write 250 words, 300 words. Now that's more difficult to know how many words you wrote if you're not using a computer. So
Yeah.
I'd go back to the page thing of do 2 pages. That by the end of the week, you got something, and it's more than you would have had if you just thought about writing and didn't do anything, or you
Right.
sat there and found excuses to do something else instead of writing. So I like to know those interesting ideas of if you say, well, I'm just going to write for word count, or I'm going to write for time, or I'm going to write for topic. And those, if I'm ever feeling like not writing, which isn't often, I mean, I do find times where you try to make an excuse to not write, but when you start writing, I feel like you can't not write, even if it's taking a note in the grocery store because you came up with an idea or a line or whatever. You got to write that down. Again, that's the difference between a writer and not, is you're writing. So
Yeah.
I like those little exercises or those little things that keep you going. Do you have any other tricks or things like that that you would recommend to people if they were having a hard time getting started or staying focused?
Well, you said that about the word count, and I use Scrivener's, and that to me is like the best tool in the world. And you can set a word count goal on there, and you get, it gives you good affirmation. Um, I do timelines. I'm a big person, and I learned that from I do what we used to call task analysis, and I project out, so I want this to be done by then I schedule it backwards. I do backwards planning, and so that has been key for me because when you self-publish, you are the master of it all, and so you have to get everything lined up. So um, it's important that the pieces are done at the right time. So yeah, backwards planning is gigantic for me.
I like that. Yeah, timelines I like a lot. I use that when I was doing teaching, and then I was like, how come I didn't think of this when I was a student? Because this would have been a great way to keep track of things throughout the years of just overlays on timelines of different things. And it really puts into perspective, especially if you're doing historical fictions or trying to keep anything straight. The timeline is key, but that working from the end backwards is great. It's also the same way you put out a Claymore mine. Those classic little mines that say this front towards the enemy, and you put it out, and then you're thinking where you want the coverage area to be. You put the mine in, and then you run your wire back to where you are. But yeah, that just made me think about that for whatever reason.
That's neat.
But the planning, that's good. Did you notice a change in students over your time teaching?
Well, yes, in a way, yes, I did, and some of it was sad
Hmm.
because I'd been in the classroom for 20 years, and the last year I was teaching in the classroom, I spent 7 years at the district level doing tech support, my last 7 years. But in the classroom, um, I got to the point where it was harder and harder to teach anything because the kids couldn't read. And I was secondary certified, so I didn't know how to teach kids how to read, had no idea. So I went to the teacher school in Albuquerque and bought phonics sheets and, worked with that. But when you don't have read, when you don't, at sixth grade, if you don't have kids that can read, it makes it very difficult then to be able to write because those two things are wedded at, they're joined at the hip. It's just the way it works. So
Right.
it was very frustrating for me. And probably, there were other things that played into me getting out of the classroom, but that was one of the biggest because it was just so frustrating, you know.
How about with administration and teaching? Did you notice a difference over your time with that?
Oh, gigantic. That was part of the reason I got out of teaching.
Mm.
Yeah, I was not supported by the principal. I taught language arts, literature, and Spanish, and he was a Spanish speaking, he's Spanish Mexican, and he didn't like that I was teaching the kid. We said the pledge. It was a bilingual school, and we would say the pledge in English and Spanish every morning, and they could say that. We had a lot of kids that were um, Spanish speaking, but they were and spoke English, but they were illiterate in both languages. So I felt like my job as a Spanish teacher was to make sure that they became more literate in Spanish. So we had and I had all kinds of games and stuff that we played, but they learned how to write out the pledge in Spanish too, which is not easy. Some of the
Mm.
words are harder. But anyway,
Mm.
the parents complained that it was too hard, and then there was some other craziness that he did. So, and then there was a gun incident that kind of played into it too. So teaching
Did you
is
go ahead?
hard. Teaching is
Yeah.
hard.
Yeah. There's obstacles to it. I found where if you're not getting the support from administration and then the reason, are you there to educate? Are you there to, I taught in college, but are you there to just get a degree or are you there to learn something so the degree means something?
Yeah.
It's, yeah, the state of affairs of education. When
And
you learned Spanish, did you learn it when you were a kid or did you learn it as an adult?
I learned it as a child. I grew up in a Spanish speaking community. We had Spanish starting in the third grade. And so I did nothing with it because I was 28 when I went back to college, and I did nothing with it until a girlfriend and I started traveling to Mexico. And after I divorced, and so I was like shocked at what I could understand, and I was shocked at what I could come up with. And she said, and I wasn't through with my degree. I was like first year into my degree, or first or second. And so she said, you ought to get a Spanish minor. And I was like, yeah, I should. Let's see if that works. Well, I went for the test to test out of first, because I was time wise, I couldn't do a full minor if I had to take first semester Spanish. So I went and did the test to test out of it. I tested out of it. I was really proud of myself. And I know why I did is because I knew how to conjugate verbs. That's how I did. So I go into my second semester class, and the very first test. Okay, we're back. Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
Okay.
You were going into your class in the very second something.
Yeah, I bombed the very first test. He had a test to try to do placement, for different things, because he did modules and stuff. And so I went in and talked to him immediately and said, should I just drop this class? And he said, no, 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 no. He said, I'll tell you what, if you can deal with getting a B, which was really hard for me because I was an A student, if
Yeah.
you can deal with getting a B and you do this, and I had to go to the lab, the listening lab 3 times or 4 times or 5 times, I can't remember, extra times a week, and do all the extra stuff I have. I think you'll be okay. I think you can get a B. So I worked so hard that semester and I got a B. So,
Nice.
and then I had a ball. I taught it for 14 years. I've been away from it now for so long that it's very hard for me. I mean, when my husband and I travel to Spanish speaking countries, I have a lot of fun, but I apologize up front and say, I haven't done this for a while. But I love the Spanish language and the Spanish people. They are just a part of my heart.
I wish in high school I would have taken Spanish instead of French. I'm not sure why I chose French over Spanish, because Spanish I think would have been so much more useful. And then a couple years ago, maybe a year or two ago, we started doing Spanish on like a language learning app on Duolingo,
Mhm.
and did that for a year or two. And I felt like I learned a lot of words. Before that, I've took a Rosetta Stone course maybe 6 or 7 years ago, and I think those two things teach Spanish differently. And I would be happy with a kindergarten vocabulary and understanding of Spanish, but it's really different from learning it and then never using it to then going to somewhere where that's all they speak. And I did get a good compliment from a person when we went to the Galapagos. One of the guides, when I was talking to him in the Spanish I knew, he said, "Well, you sound like you're Mexican." And I was like, "Oh, that's a win. That's a
Yeah.
win. I'll
Oh,
take
yeah.
that."
Yeah,
Because
that
the only
is.
other Spanish I learned was from Marines when I was in Camp Pendleton and we were deployed to the Middle East with the Marines from the West Coast were almost entirely Spanish speaking, either Mexican or born in America, but tied closely to Spanish.
Yeah.
And there, that Spanish was not cordial. So, so the Duolingo Spanish was a little different. And then in policing, I took some Spanish classes, which was like just Spanish for police. So that was a different angle from it too. than just trying to learn the language. But it's I wish I had started much younger learning Spanish than being older, and then having a place to use it is, I think, the big thing. Of course, if you don't speak it all the time, it goes away pretty quick. I found I
Yes,
can
it does.
understand it better than I can say it, and
Yeah.
that's strange.
Yeah, that is. When I got my degree, my minor, I had to do classes, literature classes. Of course, that's where I learned about magical realism and and I had to, be able to speak and have conversation. And then I took a class. We took a class from Colorado State University to Mazatlan for a month, and we lived with the students. There were 12 of us, and we lived with families, and they spoke no English. So that was a real boost for my Spanish. So there were some major mistakes, miscommunications that ended up being hilarious. So, but it was good. It was fantastic.
Nice. With your teaching, do you have any exercises that stood out in memory for writing, like creative writing exercises, if you did those things, or any other type of writing?
I think the best one that I can, yes, and it's the one that became bedrock for my classes, Natalie Goldberg's writing practice, because it was, and she's still a proponent of it and still writing, and she's just releasing a new book about the pandemic. But that mindset of being able to write for, a container, you have a container of time, 7 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, you decide how long you're going to write. And then no grammar check, no, you don't worry about grammar, you don't worry about punctuation, you just keep your hand moving. If the top, and she suggests prompts, and if the prompt takes you somewhere else, then that's okay, because that's where the meat is for you. And then you're free to, she said, to write the worst junk in America. And I used to in America and the world, and I used to tell the kids the worst junk in the universe. So it's that total space of creativity. You connected to yourself, creativity, getting it down on paper. So if you stop in the middle of a sentence, and all of a sudden you have nothing else to say, go back and bring down the prompt again, and take it again. So it's just total freedom, total freedom. And that really became the bedrock for me and my students, I think, as we worked our way through the writing, because I think they saw that practice to be useful.
So is that in one of your writing groups? That's what you still do now when you
Yes,
meet with them?
right.
Is that so? The idea there is you're there in a group and everybody's just going to write.
No, there's usually a prompt, and it's based
Okay,
on her book, Writing Down the Bone, if you've ever heard of that. Nancy
I haven't.
Goldberg's, yeah, Writing Down the Bone. And what there is a prompt. We use in my reading group that meets this afternoon, there's 4 women in the group, and so we usually have 2 prompts. And so what happens is the leader of the group gives us the first prompt. We write for 10 minutes, just keep our pen writing. The timer goes off. We write the second prompt. The timer goes off. Then your responsibility as a part of this group is, this is not a critique group. We read what we wrote, or we don't. If you don't want to read it, you don't have to. We read what we wrote, and the correct response after the reading is, "Thank you, Larada." That's all there is. There's no judgment, no comparison, no. Sometimes this group, we've been meeting since 2021, I think is when we started, or 2020, I can't remember, because it was during the pandemic too. And we know each other so well that there comes time in our shares, because our shares have become so deep, is like somebody will say, "Oh my God, Larada," or wow, Larada, that was amazing. So but yeah, that whole idea that, and it's a daily practice. that you do it. I don't do it every day. I wish, I used to be better at that, but just grab a prompt, and you can, there's people all over the internet that have lists of prompts for writing practice, so you can Google them.
Okay. And then your other writing group that you go to is a critique group, right?
Right.
So is that one where you turn in the thing to read before you go, or you read it there, or somebody else reads it there?
You turn it in before the group, and our group is such a mixture because I'm a retired teacher. There's an active scientist in the group. There's a retired, I think she was a scientist too. And then the other lady is a screenwriter. So you get, so we turn it, we present it, email it to the group before we meet. And then at the meeting, usually they print off the male scientist doesn't print it off. He does it on his computer and sends it to you, but print it off and make any suggestions. And then we go around, the four of us, with the responses. Like if they're reading my material, all four of them respond. The magic to that group is having a scientist. And then the other lady, I don't know if I can't remember what her position was. She's an artist, so I don't think she was a scientist. So anyway, left brain, right brain. I mean, the convergence of critique is absolutely phenomenal. And again, we've based it on, what did I like? What the very top of it is, what did I like? And then it goes through, okay, on this part right here, that isn't clear. Could you add some more to that? And I'm really telling you, I have taken this group's responses and changed books, changed chapters. I wrote, one of my books was the biography of the most famous square dance caller in the world. My husband and I square dance, and I grew up square dancing. And I was reading them, the chapters, as the book was evolving, but it was when it was still in the evolution stage. And so we got done one night, and Marty, the artist, said, "Larada, you're telling me," she said, "I've never square danced, but you're telling me by the way you describe it that the caller does choreography. Do they do choreography?" I had never thought of that. So we meet on Monday nights. I was doing phone interviews with the caller on Tuesdays. The next day I asked him, I said, "Okay, it came up in my writing group last night about choreography. Tell me about your choreography."
And you were talking about choreography, square
Okay.
dancing choreography.
Yeah, so I the next day I talked to the caller and said, "Tell me about your choreography." And it ended up being a whole chapter in the book that I would have never, I was too close to it. I would have never even thought that would have been a topic that needed to be discussed. And it was so rich because I learned so much about it from him whenever he was telling me what he did. So so the point of that whole thing is that a writing group is a critique writing group is probably one of the most important assets or tools that a writer can have. But a lot of people I think they feel very, I don't know, vulnerable, and that they don't want to share with someone. But that book is a child, and it's sometimes, it feels like an attack. And if you just work with the premise of the writing group, there's all kinds of websites out there to get information off of. But if you do it all, that it's in good faith, and that we start with a positive, and then anything I'm suggesting it's still in your hands. You choose whether you want to do it or not. If it resonates, do it. If it doesn't, don't do it. But I can swear on all of my books that they've worked with me on, and they've worked with me on 5 of 7 books. It's a phenomenal experience.
Yeah, I like the writing groups and those two different types. I haven't been in one that has prompts, but they're outside of just school where you had writing assignments. But I've been in writing groups that were you get together and then you just write. They were called Shut Up and Write. And that seemed a little harsh. So I tried to start one called Cease Your Prattle and Write, a little more Shakespearean. And I like the idea because it gives you that time where you're going to write. You don't have anything else to do. This is what you're here for. Plus, you're maybe around some people that have that creative thought going at the same time. So you feel a little bit accountable to be there, plus a little bit responsible to write since you're there. You might as well do that. And then the critique groups I've been a part of, and I think they can go wrong quicker than you just sit there and write group, but a good critique group is great for sure.
Yeah.
Sure. And then if you go to one and you just don't like it because you don't like the people there or whatever, then go to another one. And
Right.
if you go to 3 or 4 and you don't like any of them, then maybe it's you. But if you can find the one you like, then that's worth setting that time aside to go talk to or to go interact with them. Hopefully they have some good rules about how much, how long a piece of work can be, and you have some limits. But
yeah, we do.
yeah, I do like the writing groups. Do you have people that when you get your whole draft together, that you send the draft off to, whether it's the first draft, 7th draft, whatever it is, the draft you're comfortable with somebody looking at and getting some feedback from? Do you have a couple people, whether you call them ideal readers or whatever, that you get to look at your book to make sure everything makes sense?
Yeah, I do. They call them an ARC team, advanced reader copy. And I, oh, here we go again. I think is it blocked? No.
Yeah, we're back on.
Yeah, my husband is one that reads it, but then I have, in fact, on my new book that I'm just working on, I have 8 people that are going to look at it and critique it. I need to say something here. I didn't think about time at the beginning, but
Okay.
I'm just getting over a really bad dog attack. I had 16 stitches removed out of my right leg, and it's swollen up pretty bad because of sitting here. So if we could wrap this
Wind
up.
it up. Yeah. Here, we'll
okay.
wind it up. We'll wind it up like this. What's the best way for people to follow your work and be able to see what you've been doing?
Okay, I have a website, laradasbooks.com, and let me spell it for you because it's so different. It's Larada's Books, LARADAS, books, BOOKS.com, and all my books are on there. I'm on Amazon. I do a weekly blog. I'm on Shopify, Etsy. I'm in a variety of places. So,
Okay. I have a lot of I have the links that you sent me, so I'll put those in the show notes, which I think they cover the gambit there, so people
yeah.
can check those out. And the website, it's easy to navigate, so definitely a place that people should go look at. And you said your books were available on Amazon?
Yes, and they're also available from me.
Okay, great. Any thoughts in closing?
This has been a really great discussion. I've loved all the questions that you've asked because poetry is my and my new one is going to be "Was It a Dream?" And the subtitle is "Navigating Life's Journey Through Poetry." So
Okay.
And it's froze again.
Yeah, we're back. Okay. So those we can find on your website and also through Amazon, correct?
Right.
Okay. Sounds good. Thank you very much for your time. Hope your leg gets better. I'll
Thank
talk to
you.
you on the other side of this musical exit here.
Okay, thank you.